commonly known as Operation Just Cause. The month-long U.S. invasion of Panama a year into the presidency of George H.W. Bush is often an afterthought in overall American history, but is certainly a great contributor to the interweaving question of what the U.S. role in world affairs should be. The operation had a few targets, including the military ruler Manuel Noriega, who was running drug rings and interfering with fair elections, of course, the commerce interest of ongoing debates over access to the Panama Canal, and it was all sparked by dangerous mistreatment of residing U.S. citizens and military. The events of this operation may seem small to some, but bring back vivid, life-changing memories to the parties involved. Out of 29,000 U.S. forces, paratroopers from North Carolina made up a big strategic aspect of the conflict. My uncle is one of those officers, and I sit down with him today to hear his story of this historical moment. Here we go. Okay, I'm here with my uncle, Douglas Leach, who was a part of the U.S. invasion of Panama, Operation Just Cause, in December 1989 and January 1990. Thank you for talking with me here today, Uncle Doug.
Great to be with you, Colin.
So, to start off, I guess, could you give us a little background on yourself? Background kind of influences the lead up to this story.
Sure. I grew up a military brat myself. After college, I served as an Army officer at Fort Bragg. And knowing the history of our armed forces and their engagements, following that, whether it was United States involvement in Libya during high school and everybody stir about that, or even during my college years, the invasion of Grenada, that Operation Urgent Fury, was attuned to what was happening there. Leading up to Operation Just Cause, I'd been involved, well, obviously at Fort Bragg, trained, had a couple of different roles, but was involved in other operations leading up to that.
So you mentioned these other interventionisms, like in Grenada and Libya. Did you say you were very invested in those, like from an outside source, or?
Well, I think the typical American perspective from inside the military is it's better to be super trained and prepared, really to adopt a posture of deterrence, so that you really never have to pull triggers and actually go in a war fight. So anytime there's what they call now kinetic activity, it's almost a cause for alarm. Like, oh, really? Why are we having to pull triggers?
Yeah.
And for that reason, I was very much paying attention to what was happening, for example, in Grenada while I was in college. At the same time, there was a bit of excitement, like, oh, wow, they're actually doing stuff.
Sure. So, in the lead up to Operation Just Cause, can you describe some of the historical, I guess, context you mentioned a little bit earlier of U.S. kind of role in world affairs?
Sure. I'm just speaking obviously as a citizen.
Sure.
With a unique experience. The situation in Panama was interesting and exceptional, but also fairly typical. The United States had history, for example, in Nicaragua. I was involved with an operation earlier, I think it was called Golden Pheasant, where there was a show of force on the border between friendly Honduras and not so or perceived belligerent Nicaragua. There's also this history, right, that's personal. You may recall that the president at the time was George H.W. Bush, and he was a former head of the CIA.
Yeah.
I think he was ambassador to China in the 70s, saw what was going on in Panama and saw it through the lens of the CIA, where the head of state of Panama, Manuel Noriega, apparently was formerly on the payroll of the CIA. There's also, subsequent to that, drug running activity, gun running activity. The idea of a democratically elected leader was put aside. I think there were elections that took place, and if I remember correctly, Jimmy Carter was actually involved there in saying these elections were not properly held. And so, the United States had treaties with Panama around the canal, and security for the canal, had a military presence in country, did training in country. So that was another thread that was unique to Panama. The net sum was that there was an escalation of tensions that boiled over, where, from my perspective, the triggering activity was the Panamanian Defense Force. Essentially, these not so well organized henchmen, allied with the head of state, started detaining and maltreating American citizens in Panama, and that became kind of the overt justification to go in and create an environment, a better environment.
Sure. So you have this Manuel Noriega, the head of state there, who has, I guess, said that he has won this election. How did he go from being having an amicable relationship with the U.S. as you noted, being like part of some CIA operations, to being this guy who is dangerous to, I guess, American lives?
I can't speak to his state of mind, although I did have his wallet and driver's license in hand.
Really?
At one point. Really.
We'll get to that.
He, I can't speak to his state of mind, but it seems, based on what I saw on the ground there, that power, ego, personal economics drove him in the direction that he took, something that was not available to him in his relationship with the United States. And when I say on the ground there, I was going through places where literally, we put out a bounty on weapons, $100 any weapon, cash, $100 bill. Of course, Panama uses the U.S. currency, so people were coming out of the woodwork with Soviet-made anti-aircraft artillery, with all kinds of mines and such, in addition to small arms. I think all total, my larger team destroyed 400 tons worth of weapons that were collected across the country. Which is an interesting model in terms of incentive on the battlefield. The other piece were the drugs. I mean, we're talking going into build certain places where his operators were holed up, and massive amounts of drugs packaged for distribution. Just insane, and tons of cash.
Most seriously, it was sad to see people with cigarette burns all over their bodies. It was also troubling to see people whose arms had been broken at the wrists and their hands reset with the palms facing outward. This was a bad regime that seemed to torture its own citizens outside the rule of law.
So then you mentioned coming in from Bragg from the air. Can you describe a little bit about like what that was like your first day on the ground?
It was clearly a war zone, anarchy, lawlessness. It was eerily quiet, at the same time quite chaotic.
Compared to other operations, both before and after Panama, When I say chaos, what I mean, armed conflict is messy. It's an understatement to say armed conflict is messy. I recall seeing a slingload of batteries and bullets dropped onto a building skyscraper from too high. The cargo exploded on impact. Snipers were a problem. Panamanian military not following orders to stop was a problem. The best and worst of human nature on full display. The most modest people, civilian and military alike, of course, bore the brunt of the violence. I had a sense, like today, that our technological superiority was overwhelming. Apache helicopters addressing threats, C-130 gunships owning the night over urban areas. Our soldiers' initiative, agility, and energy were impressive. I sense that, too, in many operations, before and after that was also the case.
Imagine a modern city where there are, no traffic lights, the utility grid's unreliable, and your average citizen is hunkered down trying to stay out of the way.
Yeah.
Yet, you're there as a foreign invader essentially, and folks are taking pot shots at you.
Mm-hmm.
The first day was coming from North Carolina. I recall there was an ice storm we left in, and leaving the plane, in the tropics, elephant grass, 12 feet high, very humid. So that was a little bit of an investment.
Yeah.
Focused on okay, I got to have clean socks and lots of ammunition.
Mm-hmm.
Although I felt a little underarmed in my capacity.
Yeah.
It was surreal. Just surreal. Anarchy.
Mm-hmm. And the forces that you were coming up against, you said these were kind of like a pseudo army of Noriega, or were these like citizens picking up arms, or?
I think they were organized around him and his personal economy in running guns and drugs.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion.
So then, okay, well, you mentioned that you got to, you had Noriega's wallet at a point. I know he ended up holding up inside an embassy. I think it was the Vatican City embassy? Tell us about how you got to that point.
I think what were they playing? Welcome to the Jungle.
Yeah, I heard like it was something like, it was like Christmas Eve and they were blasting.
I wasn't around for that.
Uh-huh.
But more chance that I was in a place where he was being moved onto a U.S. plane. He was being processed.
Yeah. Do you have any vivid memories of like interacting with any of the Panamanians on the ground? You said, or like non-soldiers, as in citizens that were trying to hole up and stay away from this. And what was their kind of perception of the U.S. involvement?
I had zero interaction with any live Panamanians.
Mm-hmm.
I say zero interaction. It's like I didn't have any conversations.
Sure.
With any Panamanians, even civilians. I don't speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And it was not part of my mission at all to engage with the civilian population.
Yeah.
The personal thread runs deep. While on the ground in Panama, I was running into next-door neighbors from Fayetteville. My father's college classmate was the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division at the time. It was surreal seeing the same people dancing at the officers' club at Fort Bragg one week, and then in the chaos and anarchy of Panama the next.
So, the U.S. ends up getting Noriega, or how? Like, can you tell us about how that went down? And was that a mission success just to get Noriega, or were there other targets as far as Noriega goes?
I think that in the bigger picture, Manuel Noriega was never really the center of attention before the operation, from my perspective. You had a sovereign nation fundamentally that was broken and needed to be fixed. That the fix came from the outside, and the fix involved a lot more than just a country or a leader. It also involved, in this case, international commerce through the Panama Canal, and so to the extent that we needed to protect our assets there, the United States government needed to protect its assets there or its presence there, and then there's the larger how to set the country up for success.
Yeah.
Going forward, not so much from a nation building standpoint, but it was not. We were not on a law enforcement mission, but it essentially we went into from again, this is my personal opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
We went into restore order, where restore the local rule of law, where it was not exactly being followed, particularly as to elections or treatment of Americans.
I mentioned Operation Just Cause was not a law enforcement action. I am remembering it turned out Noriega was tried and convicted in U.S. courts after the military operation. So he was a criminal and served time. Our mission was less about taking Noriega to the United States to stand trial. There were, however, many civilian agencies involved in the overall operation. This interagency cooperation seemed to be centered around drugs and illegal weapons trade. One related example, the United States Treasury visited us. There were about 2,000 of us sitting on the tarmac at Torrijos-Tocumen Airfield waiting for planes to return home in January of 1990. About 20 C-141s landed together. To our surprise, two uniformed U.S. Customs officers came out of each aircraft rolling a big empty trash barrel. They announced to us what was contraband, declared an amnesty now before anyone got on the planes, and it was amazing to see how much contraband ended up in the barrels. One soldier started crying. He found $55,000 in cash on the battlefield that he had stuffed in his cargo pockets. That's almost $200,000 today. He was hoping to pay off his house.
Do you have like a definition of, when you're going home, like that was a mission success, or is that like a personal? Is there no really personal like pride connected to that? It's just kind of like I came and I did my job. I'm interested to see like what are the feelings.
Well, sure. I think the American military, part of the reason why it works so well is any one individual is pretty selfless. It's more about the team and the larger group.
Yeah.
So I never really looked at it through a personal lens. Yeah, I was glad to come back. I was glad to eat real food and get real sleep and that kind of thing. But looking back on it, I think that as a group, everything that we wanted to do or intended to do, we did.
Sure. One thing that I'm interested in is kind of this concept that you brought up. It wasn't as much you said of a nation building concept, but more of to kind of fix what was already there, and that there was already like a decent base, but you had to kind of secure it. How would you compare this to other like U.S. interventions, I guess, throughout history? Be that something as kind of older, like the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century, or as recent as like U.S. missions in Afghanistan?
We had war plans for Southwest Asia of all kinds, and I was actually involved in an operation that took place before and after Panama, called Prime Chance, and there you had that was more in Iran, the Iranian military disturbing the shipping lanes, not unlike the situation in Panama, where there's some risk to commerce. There's a bit of a thread there where it's how are we protecting commerce or our rights to trade across international waters. So or through whatever bodies of water we have a right to navigate.
Did you ever keep up with the events in Panama after the invasion was done? And how could you compare that to now being like a year out almost of Afghanistan, like the situations in each of those countries? Just to give us like a current comparison.
Okay, this is my personal opinion.
Sure.
Strategically, the United States loves its way of life, its form of government, its democracy.
Mm-hmm.
It thinks that that's the best for it, and it thinks
the world.
Largely it thinks that that's best for anyone that wants it.
Yeah.
Or that the United States thinks should have it.
Yeah, even if they don't. Yeah.
Well, we learned a big lesson in Iraq. You can serve up democracy to people. Here are approximately 22 million Iraqis 23 million Iraqis that really couldn't latch onto or see what they were being served. So we can wax philosophical around what people are willing to take on or even able to appropriate or see. It's not aware, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue that the whole Iraq invasion in 2003 was from if one looks at it through a business lens, it's a hostile takeover of a country that has oil assets.
Sure.
Just the way Panama was a hostile takeover of a country that has shipping assets or logistics assets. I mean that's a bit of an oversimplification and perhaps tinged with a bit of cynicism, but that's one way to look at it. I think that in the bigger picture, though, we're more about exporting democracy,
mm-hmm.
and that's a national product of the United States. Again, this is my personal opinion. So one can look at each of these military operations in that context.
Sure, that's great. Yeah. So then, from a more personal, I guess, perspective, how do you think that those days in Panama influenced your life afterwards, or even your current self?
Sure, I have 3 superpowers. One is anxiety. Was being able to see around corners.
Yeah.
And I'm still working on my 3rd one.
Uh-huh.
Over analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And all 3 of those, I think, were at least sharpened
mm-hmm.
during my time in Panama.
Sure. Understood. Thank you so much for talking today. I think we got a really... I was really interested to hear about this. It's not a big part of any history curriculum or anything, but it's certainly one of the important, I guess, stepping stones in a path of U.S. interventionism, which I think is an interesting theme throughout. Do you have any closing words, any Doug knowledge for us? Anything you'd like the listeners to know about yourself, military service, Panama, life in general, anything?
Not for recording.
All right, well then the recording's going off. Thank you very much.
Hi, Colin. In sum, I look back on this time as one where I was privileged to serve with so many good people, so many dedicated professionals, working as a team, working to accomplish a goal. Thank you, Colin. You asked, how did my experience affect me? Wow. In sum, I feel like I was in the Clancy movie Clear and Present Danger at times. I also remember reading Carl Steiner's Shadow Warriors and recognizing many of the characters as real with different names. a case of art imitating life, I suppose.